Today, we would take a look at the transformation of the industrial sector in the German lands and the manner in which the German Industrial Revolution turned Germany into the powerhouse of European economy. Towards the beginning of the 18th century, Germany appeared to be a very unlikely story of industrial transformation, simply because it did not exist. The industrialization of the German lands is a story of how more than 300 odd small states, kingdoms, principalities, bishoprics, and even independent port cities became integrated to one economic unit. The German society, the German lands were divided into more than 300 odd states which were at one point of time integral to the Holy Roman Empire. After the Treaty of Westphalia in 1648, all these component electoral regions of Germany became functionally autonomous, and each went their own socio-economic and political ways, functioning or traversing entirely different historical and economic routes to development. In this process, there were large states like Brandenburg Prussia, Austria, Bavaria, Saxony, and there were also smaller city-states, port cities like Hamburg, Bremen, and Rostock, Lübeck, with several other smaller regions, industrial conurbations in Rhineland, agricultural principalities, so on and so forth. The German economy, as it stood in the 18th century, was inexistent because various different parts of Germany traded with different parts of Europe, basically regions which were adjacent to each other. So the lands east of Elbe, constituting the provinces of Brandenburg Prussia, of Mecklenburg, Thuringia, these were predominantly agricultural lands with large landed estates held by feudal lords with whatever remained of institutionalized serfdom of the previous 200 years, carrying out extensive agricultural activity on the basis of forced labor and exporting these to the markets of Western Europe, primarily Antwerp and Amsterdam. The northern part of Germany, especially those which were adjacent to the North Sea, traded with the other neighbors they had on either side of the North Sea, so Scandinavia, Denmark, the Polish part of Russia, Great Britain. These were, and the Kingdom of Poland, of course, till it was dissolved in 1795. These became the normal economic partners of the northern German regions of Schleswig, Holstein, and the port cities of Hamburg, Bremen, and so on and so forth. To the western part of Germany lay the Rhenish principalities and city-states. There were hundreds of them scattered all along the river Rhine. And for them, the normal trading partner happened to be France. To the south lay the kingdoms of Bavaria, Baden, Württemberg, and their agricultural and animal husbandry-based economy traded extensively with the adjacent lands of the Kingdom of Austria or the Habsburg Empire. So Germany in the beginning of the 18th century was completely in fragments, and there was no single market. The reason why no single market could evolve was because each of these principalities, 300 odd principalities, had their own currency system, their own weights and measures, their own legal apparatus, and most importantly, their own tariff barriers. So for a commodity to traverse from the entire length and breadth of Germany, from the deep south to the far north, it would have to go along a number of different states, and at each of these, a fresh customs barrier, a fresh set of transit dues would emerge. So all merchandise tended to be either locally produced or would be exported or imported to and from the nearest hinterland. So if a product is manufactured in the southern part of Germany, it was more likely to be sold either in the locality or just on the other side of the Alps in the Austrian Empire. Similarly, the product of Rhineland was more likely to end up in France than it was likely to end up in Brandenburg, Prussia. The consequence of this character of customs barriers and the consequence of this fragmented market, of course, was that there was no incentive to develop the transport system running between the various states of Germany. So in the beginning of the 18th century, the concept Germany did not exist. The people spoke in the language of German, but there was no identity, no sense of identity that emerged at this stage. The principal problem that you could associate in 18th century Germany, apart from the issue of the market, was of course because of the stunted size of the market. There was hardly any incentive towards mobilization of capital. Also, in absence of there being adequate demand, there was hardly any incentive towards modernization of industrial production or expanding the market horizons. An additional complication in this particular case was, of course, that because only a handful of towns or a handful of cluster of economies was to be found on the coastal areas, German lands were not even attuned to long-distance commerce. As a consequence of the stunted size of the market, aversion to overseas commerce, as also the problems associated with the essentially localized nature of production, there was very little by way of capital mobilization of capital, very little by way of industrial innovations or even the need for industrial innovations. There was a second problem which was particularly telling in Germany in the 18th century, in the German lands in the 18th century. Lands east of Elbe were heavily dominated by the system of serfdom, which required the peasants who were in a state of servitude, they were tied to the land which they were cultivating, and the feudal lords, the seigneurial lords, ended up by extracting almost the entire surplus that was generated. So peasants, being confined to simply the act of production through a process of servitude, had neither a market demand to generate nor the capacity of moving from one region to another in order to increase their livelihood. In fact, in the eastern part of Europe, which was overwhelmingly agricultural, all sorts of industrial activity that was required was necessarily limited to the personal consumption of the overlord or of the serfs. In fact, all higher or more advanced stages of manufacturing were basically associated with the western part of Europe. So if anything more intricate than the basic utensils or basic implements were required in Eastern Europe, these would be imported from the western part of Europe, even western parts of the German lands. But in the Eastern Europe, almost all the industrial manufacture was limited to the basic necessities. Now, in the western lands, a healthy proto-industrial tendency having developed, there was the potential in terms of supply of labor for the switch ultimately to be made towards modern industrial production, but it was the market which came a cropper. In this situation of a fragmented market, stunted labor supply and complete dearth of capital, there were, in the German case, some pockets of modernity which we do not see in places like France, Russia, or even Britain. The finest exemplar of this phenomenon of enclaved modernity happened to be Prussia. In Prussia, the growing power of the state in course of the 18th century under Kings Frederick I and II tended to generate a demand for heavy industry, primarily by way of demand for guns, weaponry, and all other and a series of other requirements generated by the incessant warfare that the Prussian state engaged in, created an opportunity, a pocket of opportunity for industrialization along modern lines. In the 1750s, Prussian expansion into the region of Silesia, into the very mineral-rich region of Silesia, was dictated almost entirely by the Prussian state's need for greater access to economic resources such as iron ore and coal. And once Silesia was acquired, in their attempt to mobilize the resources of the region to sort of strengthen the sinews of the Prussian state, the Prussian government gave full support to an organization, to an institution called, to a company called the Malapane Huete, to develop the first proper modern heavy industry in the European mainland. In 1756, Malapane Huete brought in a British technician and purchased British technology to start the first coal-powered blast furnace in the continent of Europe. The coal and iron industry of Silesia was very swiftly modernized along the lines that were developed in Britain, along the technological lines that were developed in Britain. And in course of the next few decades, it emerged as the most advanced heavy industrial production unit in the continent of Europe. In Malapane Huete, the resources, the mineral resources that the region had been in, the Silesian region had been endowed with, was used almost carpe diem to develop an industrial capacity that would support the war-making capacity of the state of Prussia. A secondary demand was also generated by the requirements of the Prussian state. The Prussian state came to have one of the largest standing armies in the continent of Europe at this time. And the army, the uniform that the army required, was almost entirely procured from the cotton textile industry of Silesia. And in order to do this, for the Silesian industry to be able to manufacture all that was required by way of uniforms, special provisions, special arrangements were made by the Prussian state. So weavers from different parts of Germany and different parts of the German lands, as also outside, were given incentives to come and settle down in Silesia. They were given looms, they were given holdings, they were given houses, so that a textile industry could emerge in Silesia almost out of nothing. So both the problem of labor shortage and the problem of market had been resolved in this particular case by the demands generated by the Prussian state and the arrangement made by the Prussian state. The Prussian state went to the extent of extending full protection to Malapane Huete, the heavy industrial unit of Malapane Huete, as also the textile industry that was growing up in Silesia. Almost a similar experience one could notice in the Rhineland region to the west of Prussia, in fact, near the western frontier with France. The Rhineland region was a very interesting case, because here many small towns, many small industrial towns had emerged, particularly on the basis of proto-industry. The market share, however, never was allowed to expand. So for a very long time, the Rhenish industrial textile, while they were Rhenish textile industry or Rhenish iron industry, while they were producing fairly good quality material, never went beyond their immediate economic hinterland. There is this story that says that for a single product to traverse around 35 kilometers along the roads, along the stretch of the river Rhine, it had to pass to 17 different principalities or states, which basically meant 17 times customs duty would have to be paid. So the prices being pushed up, proto-industrial production required to cater to a very small industry was all that the Rhenish regions had. This thing changed in the 1790s, which is when modernization to an extent began in the region. In the 1790s, in association with the French Revolutionary Wars, when the revolutionary French army moved into the Rhine, occupied Rhineland, one of the first things they did was abolish the internal tariff barriers. So the fragmented market of the Rhenish region was suddenly consolidated into a cluster, and the market area began to increase a bit. This tendency continued to they continued to operate even before the coming of Napoleon, as with the progressive dissolution of these tariff barriers, the industrial region of Rhineland began to address a larger market, not only in the Rhineland but also in France, the adjacent regions of France. Napoleon pushed this development further by, in the first place, after the Treaty of Lunéville in 1803, with his determination to dismantle the Holy Roman Empire and Habsburg domination of the German lands, Napoleon broke down the barriers that existed in a large manner. So, for the states on the eastern bank of Rhine, Napoleon encouraged the larger states like Bavaria, Baden-Württemberg, Nassau and Berg to annex the smaller principalities or the smaller city states and bishoprics that were adjacent to them, which therefore consolidated the size of the market on the east bank of Rhine pretty effectively. He pushed this development still further by creating in 1806 the Confederation of the Rhine, as a consequence of which all the individual city-states and principalities on the western bank of Rhine was brought under one single administration. And with the complete disappearance of all internal tariff barriers and for the first time, one single administrative system with one single currency and a single judicial apparatus, the commercial possibilities, the commercial horizons of this region began to develop. As a result, a very vibrant and modern textile industry began to emerge in places like Krefeld, Aachen, Jülich, and other cities on the industrial conurbations began to emerge on the banks of the Wupper River. So much so that by 1804, this region had already become the largest supplier of hosiery items all over Europe. From the shift from proto-industrial to industrial technology had been therefore propelled by the Napoleonic and the French and the Napoleonic interventions. Napoleon had two other contributions to make in the manner in which the impediments of industrialization in Germany were being removed. The most significant of his interventions was with the continental system that he imposed. Napoleon's primary intention in imposing a blockade on Britain was basically to keep the British manufacturers out of the European market so that French industrial production could replace the British in the market. But as it happened, as we have already discussed, French industry was unable to fill in the British shoes in the markets of Europe. And in this void that was created, in this vacuum that was created, where a demand surplus existed, the German towns of, as we have already mentioned, Krefeld, Jülich, Aachen and Berg managed to fill in fairly effectively. And from becoming the largest supplier of hosiery items to Europe, the Rhenish textile industry actually blossomed in such a manner that by 1809, they were catering to a huge market of around 30 million consumers in both France and in Germany. By 1811, with the continental system pushing the German products into Spain and Russia, the German textile industry, for a brief period of time, became the largest producer of textile goods on the continent of Europe. Needless to say, once the continental system collapsed, the German industrial boom, textile industry boom, also sort of fizzled out. But one important development that happened was that in order to cater to this growing size of the market, the Germans had begun to import industrial technology from Britain. This import of industrial technology, needless to say, was hampered by the continental system itself, because once you stop importing things from Britain, you cannot import British technology either. But given the amount of technology that had already been imported by 1806 with the coming of the continental system, the German textile industry had taken a major leap. It had advanced considerably over the 15 years from the beginning of the French Revolutionary Wars, and was poised in a big way to take over a larger step in the times that lay ahead. A second impact that Napoleon had on the German case was the manner in which the structural reforms that were instituted in Rhineland automatically required their replication elsewhere. Well, automatic is probably a wrong word, because what happened was that, looking at popular enthusiasm at the French revolutionary reforms, as also Napoleon's structural reforms, the German rulers were actually scared. There was in fact a time when a large section of the German intelligentsia were looking upon Napoleon as the savior. Ludwig van Beethoven, the famous classical composer, even dedicated one of his symphonies, the Third Symphony, to Napoleon, because he believed that Napoleon would be the savior of the German people. And the hope he generated, the hope the Napoleonic era generated in the German lands, was striking enough to make the more conservative and large kingdoms consider the possibility that if reforms were not instituted from above, they would be pushed upwards from below. So the Prussian state began, which was the most conservative state at this point of time, began the most thoroughgoing series of reforms around this time. Under the initiative of rulers like Stein, Hardenberg, and Humboldt, the Prussian state passed around 4 major legislations between 1807 and 1822. In course of these legislations, by means of these laws, whatever remained of the bonds of servitude, the system of serfdom, were demolished. Mobility of labor was made possible. So people who were previously tied to the land of their landlords were allowed to move out as far as possible in order to provide labor to the new industrial ventures that were beginning to emerge. The other dimension, of course, was that by removing all kinds of guild restrictions on industrial production, the Prussian state was pioneering a new phase of economic activity where it was possible for technology to be imported from other countries of Europe, especially Britain. In sum, therefore, the Napoleonic intervention had been fairly good, very positive for the German lands. There was, however, one major problem associated with the Napoleonic intervention. The continental system, when it came in, it did give the Germans the possibility of establishing a stranglehold on the European market for the first time, which expanded their market horizons exponentially. However, this growth was not a natural growth. So after 1815, once the cover of continental system was removed, faced once again with British competition with a reasonably more advanced industrial technology, the Germans, they began to look for a more regulated market where they would be freed from the competition. Market competition was something that the Germans was not prepared to handle as late as the 1830s. As a consequence, the areas of modernization tended to remain limited in pockets. It did not generate a multiplier effect across the economy, so there was no general mechanization of the German economic sector, agricultural and industrial, or even transport. It is true that the Napoleonic intervention had reduced the number of states in Germany from over 300 to less than 39. Nevertheless, 39 states still meant 39 customs barriers, 39 different currencies, 39 weights and measures, and 39 legal systems. This fragmentation of the German lands, the economic and political fragmentation of German lands, stood in the way of any serious integration of the German market that would have expanded the market horizons of these pockets of modernity, these enclaves of modern industrial production in the German lands. This problem was to be overcome only in the 1830s with the coming of the Zollverein, which we will take up in the next lecture.